Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm again joined by Keith Preston, Florian, and Aleksey. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. It's always a pleasure. This is the episode 92 of the Roundtable, where we discuss the collapse. Now, I know, Aleksey, you sent a lot of videos with the MIT video. I'll let you go into more of that on your own. But for me, what got me into collapse was, for about 20 years now, I've known about peak oil. The idea, and this is very specific, right? People who criticize peak oil do so in generally a very dishonest way. They'll say that we're going to run out of oil. It's not what peak oil says. So an energy peak of any kind, oil, coal, natural gas, whatever, is when the energy return on energy investment, which is a concept developed by Charles A.S. Hall, who is a systems ecologist, reaches below parity. So energy return on energy investment is the energy you put into a system to get energy out. And Hall looked at biological systems. So, for example, a predatory animal, in order to maintain its own life, must consume as much or more energy than it expended in the hunt. Otherwise, it will die. And he's like, okay, well, let's look at a system which is just energy consumption. But let's look at this in terms of economics. And, of course, in the modern age, it's natural gas. It's oil supplemented by natural gas, coal, and nuclear. So the idea being is that, say 1930 or 40, if you use 1 barrel of oil, you could get 100 barrels of oil out of the ground, say in Texas. And that has progressively been declining. And nowadays, even with fracking, it's at best 1 to 3. So every 1 barrel in, you get 3 out. Or at worst, it's like 1 to 0.7. Which is actually a negative. Now, if you fall below 1 to 1, you have a thermodynamically unviable system. So the claim isn't that you run out of natural gas or oil or anything like that. The claim is that in order to get more, you have to expend more energy to get it out than it would take to put in to get it, which means it's just not viable. No one's going to do that. And when you get to that point, what we call collapse, and here I'm going to use the technical term by Joseph Tainter, you go from a high energy state to a low energy state, which, depending on the situation and the speed, can be quite cataclysmic, is what you would call collapse. So classic example is the Western Roman Empire, or even the Soviet Union of more recent times. And so the idea being is that all these energy sources are reaching what are called peaks, which is as much as you're going to extract in any given year, and then it's just going to decline. So, global oil production peaked sometime, I think, around 2010. And that was like as much as you're ever going to get out in any given year, and then it's just going to go down. The problem is energy consumption is always going up because, according to Jevons paradox, if you have an efficiency gain in energy use, you aren't then going to maintain your current level of energy consumption and then save energy. You're going to consume more energy. And we've been doing this for 200 years. So the likelihood of people, turning that around and stop falling into Jevons paradox is unlikely. So as energy resources go down, we're still going to have the implied energy increase of consumption. So that's where I think collapse is coming from. Now, also, when it comes to extracting this is not an energy resource, but say minerals. So one of the videos that was sent by you, Aleksey, was entitled Inside the MIT Study That Predicted Societal Collapse by 2040. And there was a couple useful definitions of concepts he gave in that video. The energy cost of extraction is inversely proportional to concentration, which means extracting minerals from an ore that contains half the concentration requires twice as much energy. Once you run out of high-grade resources, mining lower-grade resources isn't a realistic alternative. Now, of course, in that video, the example was ore. And, of course, there's a lot of rare earth materials that are essential for industrial use. But the same would go for energy as well. And obviously, so the perspective is, if you look at a strategic picture of a system of energy consumption, say system A, which is industrial civilization, and then system B, the earth, which it's on top of, if system A is demanding more energy than B can supply, then A will collapse. And that's the overall picture. Now, a lot of this has led to black eyes because many of the people who say this have given dates, specific dates that we have then passed. And so what ends up happening is you end up looking like Chicken Little predicting the sky is falling, even though the predicted doomsday day has been exceeded. Part of the problem, I think, is just, they were trying to scare people into a reaction. So they gave dates that were closer to people's, like, you're going to live through this date, so you better get on top of this problem to solve it. And all it ended up doing was backfiring. But I think if you look at the overall trajectory, are we getting closer to the Star Trek future that we were promised, or closer to an energy scarce future? And I think the overall trajectory is we're getting closer to an energy scarce future. No, you gave us a lot of the videos, Aleksey. So what are some of your thoughts on collapse?
Well, there are several points of view that we should look at. You may recall that in our first show where you have Florian and I on it, we discussed the fourth Turnian thesis. And the fourth Turnian is essentially a form of a collapse that happened in the 1930s, early 40s, that happened in the 1860s. It also happened during the American War of Independence. In American history, that is cyclical. As you see, what happens is that there's a certain paradigm that's generally set up for government and society and the economy. And that paradigm serves society for a specific period of time, usually 80 years. Then it becomes tired, worn out, inapplicable, and a whole new approach is necessary. So, for instance, in the 1860s, after the Civil War, America began flirting with the Gilded Age type of economic policy, where wealth disparities began increasing. This was the rising tide of capitalism. However, by the 1940s, it began to seem that that raw, unabated capitalism was no longer acceptable, which is why the New Deal became popular, which is also why other countries began experimenting with what's known as managerial capitalism. One example is Perón's Argentina, where there was a mixture of progressive left-wing politics, some right-wing dogmas they inherited from Mussolini, but above all, an economy where the government heavily intervenes. And we've seen this, of course, in the Soviet Union. We've seen this in Italy. Even Nazi Germany with Hitler was not exactly a free market utopia. So what am I getting at? What I'm getting at is that managerialism has become the dominant school of thought in the 1950s. Keynesian economics reigned supreme. And slowly but surely, we got to the point where it was no longer acceptable. We've experienced stagflation in the 1970s. So that was already the first step toward collapse. Yet Ronald Reagan and other neoliberal politicians found a way to salvage the situation. They found a way to reframe capitalism, perhaps not necessarily going back to the Gilded Age, but they made some steps away from managed capitalism or managerialism, and some steps toward the free market capitalism. Although of course, they did not let it become so out of control as it was in the late 19th century. Now we have a much more fundamental question. We're reaching a point where neither neoliberalism nor managed capitalism or Keynesianism, nor let alone no holds barred free market economics that we saw in the Gilded Age, none of these things seem to work anymore. And that's the point that the study makes. This is one interpretation of the MIT study. The second link I've shared with you goes into that point. The issue is not that we're going to collapse as a society, not that we're going to get wiped out like dinosaurs. It's not that we're going to be eating dogs and cats like it's Venezuela. It's not that. Instead, what we're going to see is a collapse of capitalism, as we know. There will be a collapse of growth. The standard of living that we're used to is going to decline. And Peter Zeihan, in his most recent book from 2022, makes a similar point. The book is called The End of the World is Just the Beginning, Mapping the Collapse of Globalization. So Zeihan independently arrived at the same conclusion. And he also, however, he noted that the collapse, so to speak, is already underway. The golden age that he saw went from 1995, the heyday of neoliberal prosperity, all the way up until 2017. And the way he sees it is that we are already in the process of the collapse. However, there will be a reinvigoration of the American economy toward the 2040s. And why is that? Because America has a very young demographic, relatively speaking. Millennials were born in the US in large quantities. This is also true of a handful of other countries. I believe he mentioned Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, France, and even New Zealand. See, for these countries, there is hope for recovery. However, there is also a point of commonality between Peter Zeihan and the fourth Turnian thesis. You see, the fourth Turnian thesis is an argument that after the collapse, after the fourth Jordan, there was the first Jordan, which is an era of stability, an era of conformity. And by definition, that is very much anti-capitalist. So I see a thematic continuity between the video that we've discussed, there were the presage and the end of capitalism, and the argument from Peter Zeihan and Neil Howe, Peter Zeihan and Map and the Collapse of Globalization, and Neil Howe in Fourth Jordan Thesis. You see, the collapse as we imagine it, we don't know what it will be like, but the closest guess that I can make, if I had to hazard a guess, I'd say we're looking to be more and more like China. We're looking to have, we're probably going to have still some capitalism going on, but it's going to be much more carefully managed, micromanaged. Authoritarianism is going to be the more likely outcome. And not only for the reasons I mentioned, but also for the demographic reasons. You see, millennials will be the dominant generation. And as we can see, they're all about cancel culture and silencing political opponents. They're all about creating consensus. Instead of, imagine a situation where you're having a friendly but a vigorous debate with a fellow your age, and you disagree, but you disagree in a friendly manner. And then a guy 10 years younger comes in and says, okay, guys, just hug it out. This is not your thing. Now, that's the kind of future that we're foreseeing here. So that's the demographic reason. The second reason is the technological reason. In the bell curve, Charles Murray and Richard Bernstein predicted that the cognitive elites will create a superclass, and they will use technology to their own advantage. We already see this happening with Facebook, with Google, with Elon Musk. And what Murray and Bernstein also predicted is that it's no longer going to be the case that conservatives are culturally retrograde and liberals are culturally avant-garde. No, the cognitive elites of both stripes will be more or less in the same team, and their goal will be the same as that of the elites in Brazil and much of Latin America. In fact, Murray and Bernstein used that specific reference, that it's going to be all about keeping the barbarians at the gates, but not letting the average Joe American have his way, have his say in the government. It's going to be all about rigging the system and in favor of the elites, and given the favela dwellers, your everyday conformist poor American, just enough to get by. Tyler Cowen wrote about that, and average is over, that he's advocating for a creation of favela-like residential areas that are essentially free, that resemble what you'd find in Mexico City or Rio de Janeiro. But guess what? It comes with high-tech security, so you don't get mugged there, and it comes with a Hulu or a Netflix subscription. So that is what collapse will probably look like. But you see, how Neil Howe, the author of the generational theory, would take a different approach here. He would say it's not necessarily bad. We're not going to have, Morgan and America, growth, believe in yourself ethos, as he says in the 80s and 90s. All the books and Barnes and Nobles were about three things: me, myself, and I. That's not going to be the case anymore. You see, nobody is going to be paying lip service to the American dream. That's going to fall by the wayside. What we're going to see is a society where solidarity is the most important cultural value, where the right and the left really are all for unity. And in this sort of unity, you're not going to see that much income inequality necessarily. However, there will be a very small elite who will be head and shoulders above everybody else, and they may even go far out of their way to hide their wealth. So if you want an example of the first Jordan, look at China again. Not even so much Cuba or USSR, although they're similar. You see, in that kind of society, you're the privileged party bureaucrat, you are not going to be driving a Mercedes to show off your wealth, because that's going to be seen as vulgar. What you're going to have instead is unlimited privileges. So say if you need to leave the country to have a life-saving surgery, as a privileged communist bureaucrat, you will have that opportunity. But if you are an average Joe communist, a resident of the communist society, well, your boss has to sign your papers authorizing you to leave the country. Your boss's boss has to sign. Your neighbor probably has to sign. Your teacher has to sign. And, a communist society will just restrict your freedoms as much as possible. Now, what I'm foreseeing is not necessarily even communist, but it will probably be egalitarian. See, if collapse means the end of capitalism, it's going to mean that we will have nothing and we'll be happy with it, as we already heard this before, the Davos Economic Forum, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, so it's going to be a society characterized by conformity, authoritarian intrusion into society, extremely limited economic opportunities for the average person, and a very hypocritical elites who go far out of their way to downplay their position of power and privilege. So how dystopian does that sound? I would say maybe not excessively, but to classical liberal mindset, it sounds quite appalling, to be honest. This is truly the opposite of how one may interpret the American Constitution and the concept of individual rights. I do believe, however, that by the time this collapse happens in the 2040s, when millennials become the dominant generation, millennials control the culture, and millennials control the Senate and the Congress, and millennials control the executive house of government, the presidency included. Well, then I'm quite certain they are going to abrogate the Constitution of the US, and they're going to follow the Latin American example of writing a new constitution where the new terms and conditions are decided by a referendum, but of course, votes can be bought in a Latin American society. It's not that difficult. It's not at all difficult in a society where half the people live in a favela and depend on government for food. Look at Argentina. It's not that difficult to buy votes, whether you do this shamelessly and brazenly, or whether you do this with a subtle nudge and with a modicum of discretion. So in summary, we're going to see peak levels of corruption. We're going to be seeing social stratification, but there will be more equality among the poor, and we will also see a rise of authoritarianism and the use of technology to stage surveillance and thought control of all citizens who appear to be, let us say, anti-conformist.
Okay, Florian.
Yeah, that sounds that sounds terrifying, I have to say. Like, not global collapse, but the collapse of the U.S. Well, or the U.S. constitutional U.S. as we know it. Well, so far, I have to say that authoritarian regimes are apparently the worst to deal with any collapse. In fact, they have all collapsed before the world has seen any stages of collapse, right? So I'm not sure whether we really have an authoritarian regime in the future, or more authoritarian presence, similar to South America. Although I clearly see there's a danger of that happening, especially with the millennials and Generation Z coming to power. Although it all goes cyclical, as we know from Strauss Howe. So I'm not so sure that it goes into one like homogeneous future, which would be more like South America, right? There's always enough discontent in the U.S. to shape things in a different way. Um, I do agree with people that rich people actually, I think they call it stealth wealth. Rich people will rather lie down. So like poor people will often they often brag that they have more money than they actually have, whereas rich people will actually downplay their wealth out of personal to defend themselves against people that want to get their money, and also because maybe they think it's gauche to brag about money. Um, I think I think something like that, like a two-class society, can definitely happen because we are thanks to the internet, the people that will form the elite will simply be the more intelligent people. Now, in the past, you could get by with a job where you had a job in the post office, and you would have people that you need people that sorted the letters and packages, and those jobs, of course, are now all gone. And so we need people that are more intelligent than others will thrive more, and they may indeed um, form like a elite class. But since we already have those classes, I don't think I think I would more likely envision that it's becoming worse, but that it's not going all out South America. I just can't imagining that happening, which which doesn't necessarily say it's not happening. But if I come back to what Keith always said, that we live in a society that will move towards a multipolar society, then something like South America is difficult for me to imagine happening in the US, because that requires a homogeneous society, and that is just not forming anymore. You have too many options to form your own tribe via the internet and via people you learn to know through technology, right? So um, it's more likely that people will check out of the system and only associate with people that are that are like-minded. And in that way we may have maybe something like, I could imagine something like Germany around the mid of the 19th century, where you had like lots of small fiefdoms, and like you had like every county basically had a different duke or archbishop or archduke, right? And the movement in the 1850s, the 1840s in Europe was to unify, and liberalism back then meant to unify, and they wanted to have a unified Germany. And so that may be the next step, but after multipolar society. But I think the next step will be, if you want to go with that the US will collapse in its present form, I would say then people will sort themselves into smaller communities, which can be very capitalist in their essence again, and they will extract themselves from the government influence and do their own thing. I think that seems to be a little more likely to me, given how things are developing, and also taking Keith's ideas into account.
All right, Keith.
Yeah, about 20 years ago, I published an essay on, it's still on the attackthesystem.com website, called The Death of Empire. And what I was doing at the time was, that was at the height of the anti-globalization protests that were happening back then. And was also around the time that the Americans' war on terrorism was really rolling, when the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq and all that. And for about 10 years prior to that, I had been reading a lot of collapsitarian literature, like, people predicting what was going to happen, when the system finally collapsed. And of course, in that, you have a lot of conspiracy theorists and survivalists and people that are today called preppers and things like that. So I was always interested in that topic. And of course, I was a very young adult when I saw the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact countries as well in the late 80s and early 90s. So I was always thought that was really interesting how that happened. Because somebody say, because I grew up in the latter part of the Cold War. I grew up in the 70s. So, somebody had said back then, well, in a decade or so, the Soviet Union is not going to even exist anymore. I would be like, you're crazy. What are you talking about? They control half the world. So it's interesting how things like that do happen and do change very rapidly. But in that essay, Death of Empire, that I wrote about 20 years ago, I was trying to predict what the world was going to be like in the future, because I thought at the time that the result of things that were going on then would be that this kind of unipolar world that emerged at the end of the Cold War was going to recede a bit, because I thought it was going to be overextended. Like, I thought that the wealth inequality worldwide, as well as in the developed countries, that was being generated by globalization and neoliberalism, was going to create instability. And I also thought that with what the United States was doing with its war on terrorism was having the effect of overreach, where the United States was going to overextend itself and start to internally fall apart as a result. And we started to see that happen now, 20 years later. Like I thought back then that eventually we would see the rise of the BRICS countries. And that was a brand new thing back then. The BRICS were a brand new thing back then. But I thought eventually the BRICS would start to develop as an alternative alignment in opposition to the West, and that's really been consolidated in recent times in opposite in response to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and things like that. And in fact, the current situation in Gaza seems to be fueling it as well. So I thought that we would move more towards multipolarity, where the United States would not be able to maintain global hegemony indefinitely the way it was able to right after the Soviet Union fell apart. And I also predicted that the United States domestically would start to undergo certain changes where we would see more and more political fractiousness. We would see more social economic polarization. We would start to see this stuff that today is called woke, or PC, or whatever you want to call it. That would become more pervasive and become more like a self-legitimating ideological superstructure for the wider ruling class. To put it in a Marxist type of framework. And I also predicted that the United States would eventually start becoming more like the European Union, in the sense it would be really like the European Union is not really a country. It's just a collection of countries with its, it's just a trade zone and has its own currency. And I would predict the United States would become more like that. It would become a collection of subcultures that really had its own thing going on. And then we might still use the dollar, and we might still pay taxes to Washington, D.C. to fund the Pentagon. But other than that, it's really not even a unified country anymore. It's fractured into a multiplicity of countries. So most of the stuff that I was writing about 20 years ago has either happened or started to happen nowadays. Now, as far as the analytical stuff that I've done in the past, I've always thought the three main weaknesses in my approach are in the area of ecology, demographics, and technology, because I'm not quite as adept at predicting how all of that is going to evolve in the future, because I'm just not a specialist in those areas. One thinker that influenced me quite a bit was Martin van Creveld. He's an Israeli military historian who talks about the decline of the state. Like, he talks about how after the Treaty of Westphalia, you had the rise of the modern state, and the definitive characteristic of the modern state is a monopoly on violence, as Max Weber said. But Van Creveld argued that the state was starting to lose legitimacy, because he was saying that people increasingly are less loyal in terms of their personal affiliations to their particular nation state than they are to whatever subcultural group they belong to. And he thought this was a worldwide trend. This wasn't something just happening in the West or the Middle East or whatever. And he was saying that the world is returning to being like it was in the pre-modern era, where, if you look at pre-modern era politics and geopolitics and statecraft, you see that people aren't necessarily thinking of themselves as patriotic towards their particular country, like being a good American or a good Russian or good German or something. They think they may be loyal to their religion, to their city state, their business organization, their band of pirates, their mercenary army or whatever. And Van Creveld, and also William S. Lynn, who's the leading theoretician of fourth generation warfare, argues this as well, that states are losing their legitimacy, and you see power being transferred or legitimacy being transferred towards these subcultural groups. And you see that in the United States today. Like, in the United States, whenever whenever one of the parties wins an election, the other party thinks it's illegitimate by definition. Like, if Hillary Clinton won, well, it's only because the Russians rigged the election. Or if Joe Biden wins, well, it's only because the Democrats stole the election. They cheated. What that shows, I think, is not so much that there's more cheating than before, as much as the system is losing legitimacy, because if you view your opponents as existential enemies, then any victory by your enemy is by that definition illegitimate. An extreme example, obviously, is Israel and Hamas. That's not just a football game that's going on there. They view each other as existential enemies. So as far as where we are now, a lot of the stuff I was writing about in the beginning of the 20th century started to happen. And the question is, where's it going to go? And I think that the big variables in that are to what degree the current system is able to endure over time. Like, is it going to be a technological collapse or regression, or is technology going to explode so that in the way that has a totally transformative effect? There's also the impact of demographic collapse, like Peter Zion writes about, and then there's ecological factors. I'm not a big eco freak or whatever, climate fanatic and all that kind of stuff, but ecology obviously matters. And I've heard some theoreticians speculate that we may be headed towards something like the crisis of the late Middle Ages, which is in the late Middle Ages, like roughly the 14th century, 1300s. We had a lot of things going on, primarily in Europe. I mean, this has to do primarily with European history. But the theory is, well, because of ecological problems, political instability, religious conflict, demographic collapse, pandemics, all of these kinds of things that were going on in the early Renaissance period, late medieval, early Renaissance period, those things are starting to appear in modernity now. We've had the pandemic, we've got ecological crises, we've got demographic crises, we've got impending, some people think, economic collapse. Certainly we have, political instability. Certainly we have, I wouldn't call it religious conflict, but we have cultural conflict that mirrors religious conflict. It's quasi-religious, I suppose. So the big, I know William S. Lind argues this. He argues that we're headed towards something, not just in the United States, but worldwide. It's going to be more like the crisis of the late Middle Ages, where we have this full collapse that, in his view, is rooted in the fact that states around the world, ruling classes, whatever you want to call them, have a crisis of legitimacy. They're not able to maintain the loyalty of their subjects because nobody takes them seriously anymore. It's like in the United States, I mean, who has respect for the president? I mean, constantly, the current president is being made fun of as just this senile old fool. And then the previous president, Mr. Trump, was viewed, by his opponents in the same way, as this bumbling oaf. I mean, it's, we Americans don't think of their leaders the way they thought of, I mean, like I remember when Ronald Reagan was president, there were certainly people who didn't like him, but he was very popular. He got reelected by a landslide, like 49 out of 50 states in 1984. And while people didn't worship him as a divine figure, he was thought of as a good president, a good man, even if you didn't agree with all of his policies. Same thing with John F. Kennedy, who's a Democrat, and there were people who certainly didn't like him. You had people that were anti-Catholic. They didn't like that he was a Catholic, or people who didn't like him because he was Irish. But but he was still popular, and people were genuinely sad and shocked when he was assassinated. Nowadays, if a U.S. president was assassinated, probably nobody would care. It would just be, yeah, whatever.
Half the country would cheer.
Yeah, half the country would cheer, and then the rest would just view it. You'd have a small minority of hardcore partisans that would be sad. Some would cheer, and then others would be like, yeah, well, it's just like the school shootings and 9/11. I mean, just more terrorism, whatever, it happens. Yeah, so I tend to think we're headed for a crisis period, and that fits with the fourth turning thesis as well. It also fits with the MIT thesis from '72, but it also fits with this wider theoretical framework that argues we're actually headed towards almost like a civilizational paradigm shift, similar to the crisis of the late Middle Ages.
Right. So a few things here. I think that whatever future political systems are okay. So if we look at the rise of modern society, beginning in the 1800s with the Industrial Revolution, the sorts of political systems we're talking about, whether they're like liberal democracies or fascism or socialism or Latin America or communism or managerialism, are all the result of high energy societies. And the point that I'm trying to get across is that we are going into a low energy society. So I think you're going to have more luck predicting the future if you look at historic pre-modern societies as paradigms and norms, because they were already developing within a quote low energy system, whereas these other systems still require a relatively high amount of energy compared to historic norms and averages. And so in the decline down, there might be brief periods where it looks sort of like a socialist country, sort of like a fascist country, sort of like a Latin American country. But I don't think it'll stay there. And I don't think it'll stay there because the energy levels needed to maintain it won't be there. And furthermore, all of those systems were prior material conditions that do not exist now. So all of them have been swept away in the face of digital technology, which will still exist probably right up until the power goes out. So it's difficult to imagine certain of these systems reemerging under the current set of industrial technological conditions. So, for example, Marxism was rooted in a sort of urban proletariat, which just doesn't exist anymore. Fascism was primarily rooted in a bunch of disgruntled veterans after World War I guess that could happen again. The other thing is, I don't find the objections that many techno-optimists make very compelling, because first of all, they've never really dealt with a thermodynamics question. And second of all, why would technological growth or innovation be exempt from the law of diminishing returns? At a certain point, each unit cost to get more is just going to be not worth the effort. And so it won't get done. And so if we assume that at some point, any model based on continued development or growth will break down at a certain point. Also, to go on that a little bit more, this idea that we're going to have more, we can see a good example, right? So from like 1906, I think it was when the Wright brothers flew their airplane, right up until 1972 or 3, when you had the last Apollo manned mission to the moon. Mankind did, something within a 70-year window that most people had only imagined. And then all of a sudden, it just stops. It just stops. Now, the technological growth is then redirected into digital technology, which I argue a pretty good case can be made that it was a part of a intentional control grid. Surveillance Valley, The Rise of the Military-Industrial Complex by Yasha Levine goes into this. So once you got to a certain point of, I guess you could say, aerospace development, we just stop. And then all effort is redirected into this surveillance control grid. And part of what Yasha says is going on is they're afraid of all these threats to the system. They can't track them. But if they can get everybody, not necessarily chipped, but everybody in this digital space, they can then track them. Initially, this was a project called LifeLog. And then the day that LifeLog is canceled, Facebook starts up using exactly the same software. So the thing is, we've already, and John McGrew points this out, we've already been in decline since the 70s. The Rust Belt phenomena in the Midwest is proof of this. The fact that we got to this high watermark of aerospace technology and then have since gradually declined to the point where NASA can't put a man in space. We're already seeing it, right? Now, in the 70s, that would have been hard to see at the time. I guess the MIT study claimed to have seen it. But I think it's already happening. And in future societies will look a lot more like societies of the past, because societies of the past were already built around low energy expectations. Aleksey.
I would like to address some of the comments that Florian and Keith made. So I'll start with you, Florian. If I interpret you correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, just type that on the chat. You're saying that in order for a Latin American style of a regime to exist, there must be more homogeneity, as I understand you. There must be more unity. However, I would tell you that Brazil, for example, is much less unified than it may appear to be. Sure, Brazil has a coherent national identity, and the United States does not. But Brazil is a highly diverse country as well. So, for example, where I live now in Santa Catarina, there are a lot of German-speaking people living in the mountains, just 2 hours from the sea, and then there are plenty of Portuguese-speaking people, actually ethnic Portuguese, and there are Angolans. There are some indigenous people. See, in Brazil, essentially, has always been an extremely unequal society, not despite its lack of ethnic homogeneity, but I would say partly because of it. You see that when you have a highly homogeneous society, like, say, Sweden, there is generally an easier time for people to trust one another and to look out for one another and to have solidarity and so on. See, this is actually a critical difference between countries like Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil. Argentina and Uruguay are much more homogeneous than Brazil, yet throughout most of their history, they had and still have much lower levels of wealth inequality. So that's actually helpful, maintaining a society that where there is the middle class, where there is the unity. However, when you have a lot of chaos, as you do in Brazil, ethnic disagreements, you see that in Brazil you have a great deal of racial mixing. However, it's evident that lighter-skinned Brazilians tend to be more prosperous. Even if they're mixed race, they're more likely to live in the South, to live in a safer area, and than, say, the dark-skinned people. If you are Brazilian of Angolan ancestry, it's far more probable that you will be in a favela of Rio de Janeiro. On the other hand, if you're a mixed-race Brazilian who's more European than African, well, your life experience will probably not differ that much from that of an Uruguayan who enjoys a much higher standard of living. Now, Florian, I'm reading your comment. I'm saying that, am I arguing that cultural and intellectual homogeneity do not matter if people live from paycheck to paycheck and don't own assets? Well, that's pretty close to that. You see, that's what we see in Brazil, that you see a mixed race country where there is much less racial segregation in the US, but you also see a great deal of cultural diversity within Brazil. The Northeast is quite different from the South, from the Southeast or the Southwest. So if anything, the lack of solidarity, the lack of homogeneity, and the lack of unity, if anything, makes it easier, not harder, for the ruling class. For the ruling class to create the kind of a collapse scenario that we're talking about, where everybody just gets along, where everybody lives off beer, chips, and Netflix, and the magnanimous elite pay their dues to society with their version of noblesse oblige, which means, all right, we're going to have high-tech surveillance for these great favelas, gritty neighborhoods where the impoverished masses are huddled together. And then, of course, they'll provide the bare bones sustenance, just enough to get by, just enough to keep them entertained, and just enough to essentially buy their loyalty. You see, that's how the elites will continue to stay in power in a society like Brazil and the US. And I do believe that despite the cultural differences and the historical differences between Brazil and the US, the two countries are more similar than dissimilar. The levels of inequality are more similar between the US and Brazil than say Uruguay or Spain. Uruguay is a Latin American country, but its levels of inequality have more in common with what you'd find in Europe than in Latin America. So, okay, homogeneity, to my mind, Florian, I don't believe is a requirement for a dictatorship. Sure, I see what you're getting at, that societies like, say, Russia or China are quite homogeneous, and it's easier to create an overarching ideology that everybody agrees on. And Marxism led to totalitarianism in Russia and China. Well, yet it did not really lead. It did not really lead to tyranny in Scandinavia. You see, Scandinavia did not have a serf state so much. Before communism, over 90% of Russians were serfs. In Scandinavia, not so. So an ideology of egalitarianism may, in fact, be somewhat democratic under certain circumstances. However, I do not see this happening in the U.S. I don't see the kind of a first turning reminiscent of the 1940s, where we have a great deal of trust in our institutions, where our economy is genuinely growing. Although Neil Howe does foreshadow that, does foresee that, I'm skeptical. Neil Howe also projected that we'd be seeing a diminution of wealth inequality, and we're not seeing that. We're seeing an exacerbation of it. So what I'm seeing, if anything, is we're gonna have a Brazilian style of class distinctions, but of course a little safer than Rio de Janeiro, more high tech, and of course a little bit more by way of a genuine noblesse oblige. You see, in Brazil there is not much of a welfare state to go around. Sure, the right will scream about how Lula is buying votes, how Lula is just expanding this family program plan where he pays people to have children. Yeah, sure, he does offer some benefits, but that's to call this a welfare state, to say that Brazil is a welfare state, would be laughable. But what I do see happening in the United States is that we're going to see a Brazilian setup, an aristocracy of sorts, the untouchable elites, who will provide a little bit more for for the average American. And that just means Netflix, Hulu, beer money, fast food, and so on and so on. And so, okay, so Keith, back to your point regarding illegitimacy of states. What you're describing is true of the third term. You see that while Ronald Reagan was a popular president, that's the beginning of the third term. And toward the end of the third term, we saw that Bill Clinton became a clown. A journalist asked him what color of underwear he wore, and Bill Clinton responded as if that were an appropriate question to discuss with the head of state. And Bill Clinton never had any issues discussing his sexual life out in public. See, this is already an instance of what you were talking about, the third term, the culmination point of it. Extreme individualism, rapid exacerbation of wealth inequality, an edgy culture. I remember what music used to be like. We used to hear a lot of gangster rap and grunge and Nirvana and a lot of profanity on the radio. That's how things were, I want to say, all the way up until 2008. But after 2008, we've seen a demand for a different kind of a politician. Say what we may about Barack Hussein Obama. And I'm no fan of Barack Obama. I do believe that he did bring back a little bit of dignity to the office of the presidency. And of course, this represented a significant improvement in decorum, civility, and erudition when compared to George W. Bush. You see, George W. Bush was smart enough to not only get into Yale, but also graduate from Yale. And then the academic standards used to be higher. And if you watch how George Bush spoke before becoming president, you see that he was much more articulate. He deliberately dumbed himself down for the same reason that Bill Clinton did. Yeah, this only worked up until the financial crisis. The financial crisis marked the beginning of the fourth term. That is when there was the demand for stronger leaders. You see, Barack Obama sold himself as an intelligent, capable, and an articulate statesman, and that's now the pattern. However, Donald Trump, as much as he could be made fun of for being the opposite of Obama's educated competence, he is still seen as a strongman by many of his supporters. Donald Trump is the kind of a populist who reinvigorates belief in government among his supporters. He's a bit like Viktor Orban or Vladimir Putin or Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, or even Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Of course, I've lived in Mexico long enough to know that many Mexicans love to make fun of AMLO. But he has something to be, there's something to be said for his humble lifestyle, for his honesty and simplicity. You see that there was a backlash reaction to the illegitimacy of government. And we began seeing this all across the world, roughly around the time of the financial crisis, when the United States entered its fourth term. Now, if we go back and look at the Russian fourth term, what happened there is that the fourth term began in the 80s, when we did not even have food on the shelves. When we began seeing a drastic decline, and Gorbachev's perestroika collapsed, that did not generate the right results. The fourth term got much worse in the 90s in Russia. But then what happened during the first term? Well, Vladimir Putin's election represents the first term in Russia. It happened there 20 years earlier than in the US. So I'm foreseeing some kind of authoritarianism, perhaps not as vicious for the US when we come out the other end of the fourth term. So essentially, the first term means that there is going to be a revitalization of the belief in the government. And we're already seeing some of this. We're not only in the US, but we're seeing this across the world. That, as Peter Zeichen predicts, the globalization is coming to an end. An era of unprecedented openness and liberty is coming to a close. The sun is setting on that epoch. What we're seeing instead is the opposite. We're seeing recalcitrant nationalism. We're seeing a personality cult of leaders, be they Obama, be they Trump, be they whoever. Joe Biden is an exception. He's not the rule. This is not a return to the Clinton times where the president is meant to be made fun of. What I do foresee happening is that when Joe Biden steps down, he will be replaced by either a Democrat or Republican who represents a renaissance of belief in the concept of the state. So, Keith, I definitely would like to take issue with your idea that we're seeing that there is a long-term pattern, that there's a long-term trend an enduring trend of decline in the legitimacy of the state. I'm seeing a reversal of that. That has already happened and that has already passed. Now we're moving in the opposite direction. And if nobody takes Joe Biden seriously, you can bet that the cultural establishment that supports him, like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, all these woke corporations to bankroll him, these people have much more cultural capital than Joe Biden ever will. And these are the people who are calling the shots. This is the true face of the Democratic Party, the ones who are censoring our freedom of expression on social media. If that's not the legitimacy of the idea of legitimizing centralized power, I don't know what is.
All right, Florian.
Yeah, I think it's. I agree with a lot what Aleksey said, and especially when he said that what Zion predicted, that the era of global unrestricted freedom is coming to an end. And I was thinking, no, you will never put the genie back into the bottle. We are free now. We can talk. Some government officials can try to shut us down, but they will not be successful. But maybe what's really going on is that we all sort ourselves into our own bubbles, where of course we are free to say whatever we want, and nobody will have issue with anything, right? So in that way, one of the groups may cling to government, may focus on government for themselves, may believe more in government, but you have more people that are sort of like skating by outside of government, and that don't really need the government much. So the question is whether the government, it may be that people cling to the government more in the future, but the question is how much power the government will really be able to exert nowadays in our technology fragmented landscape. You don't have television anymore. You have like lots of small social media bubbles that it's difficult to influence people either in real life or online.
Okay, Keith.
Well, I should probably clarify a bit what I was saying earlier about the declining legitimacy of the state. I wasn't talking about the loss of legitimacy in the sense that people don't accept an individual government or individual leader, where it's fashionable to make fun of the president or whatever. I was talking more about the decline of the state as an institution, in the sense that worldwide we're starting to see the proliferation of a greater number of failed states. We're starting to see different parts of the world where a stable system of government is not able to take root and maintain itself in the first place. Obviously, the Middle East is an example of that. Increasingly, well, I don't know, increasingly, perhaps always, Africa is an example of that as well. Much of Latin America, we see this problem, including our neighbors to the south, Mexico. That's a pretty obvious example. Obviously, parts of South Asia, the global south generally, we see the state as an institution, not just individual leaders, not just individual governmental systems, but the idea of the state as the institution with a monopoly on violence, the Westphalian model of the state. That seems to be increasingly unable to sustain itself in a greater number of places. And now we're seeing that happen in the West, where you see the West fragment into all these sectarian, particularly the United States, fragment into all of these sectarian, tribal, socioeconomic, subcultural, whatever groups. So it's not that. So it's certainly possible that there could be a decline in the state and a growth of authoritarianism on a more general level, because people that feel insecure are more likely to want authoritarian leaders for their own tribe, because they want to be protected from whatever perceived dangers there are. And that explains the growing popularity worldwide of strongmen or perceived strongmen like Trump, Putin, Orban, Erdogan, Rodrigo Duterte, Bolsonaro. Well, he got voted out, but Trump did too. But all of these kinds of figures, left and right, we do see Modi as another one. All of these figures, left and right, we do see rising, but that's because of the growing instability that we see worldwide, which is rooted in this wider collapse in the legitimacy of the institutions of modernity, And in some parts of the world, we actually have real, for real failed states. Libya, obviously, is a failed state. You know, Lebanon amounts to a failed state. Increasingly, Israel is becoming a failed state. Some other states barely hold on. So when thinkers like William S. Lind and Martin Van Creveld are talking about the decline of the state, they're not talking about the growth of libertarianism or anarchism or something like that. They're talking about the loss of the monopoly on violence and the parallel loss of legitimacy. That doesn't mean that when the state loses legitimacy, people are going to go and become, become anarcho-capitalist or something like that. It just means that they're going to shift their loyalties towards other things, other entities and leaders who may in and of themselves be very authoritarian. A good example is the growth of this kind of Islamist fundamentalism, or what you want to call it, Wahhabism, Salafism. That stuff certainly is about as authoritarian as it gets. It's about as anti-progressive, anti-modernist as it gets. At the same time, you see people in parts of the world shifting their personal allegiance towards those kinds of movements because they see their actual states as illegitimate. People say, well, like Muslims, they say Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, some of these other Islamic countries, they don't do anything for us. We're going to give our loyalty to some of these other movements that are extra state movements. And you see that in the United States too, with these rise of what's called counter gangs. You see the everything from the Proud Boys to QAnon to Antifa to all of these Black Lives Matter. All of these kinds of things represent counter gangs, or even some of these internet subcultures that we see. These are people trying to find affiliation, belonging, identity, for some of them security, outside of conventional institutions. So that's what I mean by the collapse of the state. The question is, how far is that going to proliferate? Is it going to become, on an international level, so pervasive that it ends up being like the crisis of the 14th century? And it certainly doesn't have to go that far. And like Aleksey says, one thing that I've seen in a lot of the literature of the technophiles and tech bro types is this idea, well, in the future, we can have a world that's ruled by this tech elite, where, Peter Thiel is like this, feudal overlord. And then we can have these gated communities for the affluent and wealthy, or the elite, or whatever, just like they have in Latin America with their own machine gun toting bodyguards and that kind of stuff. And to keep the rabble in line, we can give them a universal basic income, to buy an adequate supply of weed and beer and cigarettes and pornography and whatever. In fact, I think that's why that universal basic income idea, which has its roots it does have its roots in it, but it's something that's become popular among the tech industry elite types. And you start to see a guy like Andrew Yang, who was, comes out of that milieu, although he's fairly moderate compared to some of them, but you start to see that entering the mainstream discourse all of a sudden. As far as the idea of whether you can have a strong state or a strong ruler in a heterogeneous society, I think Saddam Hussein is an example of how you can, at least for a time. I think where he went wrong is he started trying to actually go up against the United States, which was, so they took him out. But for a long time, Iraq was structured as a system of strongman, Hobbesian Leviathan rule in a multicultural society. The Sunni ethnic religious communities that Saddam Hussein represented was actually a minority in Iraq. The majority of Iraqis are Shia. That's why when the Iraq War happened, and George Bush was saying, well, we want to bring democracy to Iraq. And people were saying, well, you do that, and Iraq's going to become a satellite of Iran. And that's exactly what happened. And that's what Iraq is today. But you had in Iraq, you had the minority Sunni, you had the majority Shia, you also had the Kurds, of course, and other smaller groups. And Saddam Hussein managed to rule over all of that as a Hobbesian strongman for decades. Tito's Yugoslavia was an example. Tom Sunik, the European New Right figure, I've discussed that with him before, and because he's actually Croatian, so he grew up in Tito's Yugoslavia, and he talks about how Yugoslavia had the communist Yugoslavia had a lot of the features that you see in the West today. There was this big emphasis on multiculturalism, only they didn't call it that. They just called it internationalism, Marxist internationalism, workers of the world unite, that kind of stuff. But it amounted to the same thing in practice. This idea of celebrating diversity as an end unto itself, and that in turn ended up being things like quotaism and that kind of spoil systems in terms of government offices and patronage and that kind of stuff. And they also had in Yugoslavia, they also had what in the West would be called hate speech laws, that is, anti-vilification laws and that kind of stuff. And we see how that turned out. But it is possible that you could have a strongman ruler over a unified nation in a way that is multicultural or multi-ethnic. To some degree, Russia is like that. There's a lot more diversity in Russia than what all the white nationalist fans of Russia in the West think it is. And there's other examples as well. But it's also true that when a state enters a period of decline, you start to actually see greater diversification in many ways. The Roman Empire in its latter period is a good example. And I think we see something similar happening in the Western world today. We see this emphasis on diversity and all of that in a way that's is somewhat reflective of what you start to see when you see imperiums that are in a state of decline.
All right, so we'll be moving into final statements. Let's try to keep it short. I'll just say this: I think that as we go into political crisis decline, what we've seen in the last 50 years is that what the globalist West does is it just cuts costs. So when it comes to dealing with these issues, I think we can make some predictions based on that. One is there'll be more wars to acquire resources. That's kind of a given. But then two, I don't think they're going to have this big favela system with like digital surveillance. I think they're just going to have all these people get liquidated. They're going to have suicide camps. First of all, this idea was explored in the science fiction novel Canticle for Leibowitz to deal with radiation poisoning victims. But in this case, it'll be like Canada with MAID. It's like, life sucks. Just your quality of life's terrible. We'll end it for you. That's just the cheapest. That's the cheapest way to solve the problem. And they've got robots to do all the other work. And we can also point to 2000 Wired magazine article by Bill Joy, Why the Future Doesn't Need Us. He's talking about the tech oligarchs. And he says that that's definitely one of the plans on the table. So that's sort of what I'll end with. We'll give you your final thoughts, Aleksey.
Well, Todd, that's a disturbing prospect. Quite morbid, isn't it? That we'll have suicide camps. I don't know. I can imagine that happening in China. I can even imagine that happening in Korea, where suicide is honorable. I don't see this happening in the most individualistic society of our time. I do believe that the United States will have to essentially abrogate its tradition of individual rights, economic independency, and all this idea of cowboy capitalism is headed for the ash heap of history. With the way that American culture is today, I find it impossible to imagine that Americans will turn to the idea that he who does not work does not eat. There is a saying that amounts that in the Russian language, and yes, there have been detention centers for social parasites. We still have these things in Belarus. See, if you're nostalgic for communism and you think that there is something romantic or utopian about it, you're more than welcome to go to Belarus. It's cheap. You can get an Airbnb for $500 in Minsk, and you can go out to dinner for $15. Just be mindful that there's a polite gentleman who speaks some English and sits at the nearby table could well be a secret policeman. So you better be careful of what you film. And that's the kind of a society where, yes, the social parasite will starve. There are, of course, people in the US, some libertarians, some anarcho-capitalists, who think that way. And surprise, surprise, some of these ANCAPs overlap with the alt-right people who have converted to Orthodox Christianity. And they now support this concept of literally starving the parasites. Yes, there are people like this, but they're never going to be in the majority. If anything, America has turned its back on libertarianism. We've turned our back on freedom of expression. We've turned our back on free markets. We've turned our back on academic excellence. I cannot find a single component of classical liberalism that America still takes seriously. If anything, I find that the social media tycoons are working towards just the opposite. They want to eliminate and essentially castrate the spirit of Americans, the spirit of American individualism. They want to do away with it. They want to replace it with something much more effeminized. In fact, I'd like to refer to the concept of Hofstadt's cultural dimensions. There are 6 dimensions under, and one of them is masculinity. And the most masculine society is Japan. Well, one of the most masculine. It scores 95 out of 100. And in Japan, it is dishonorable to be a slacker. It is dishonorable to be useless, to not pull your weight. And this kind of a person can only honor themselves by committing suicide. See, if you have that kind of masculine society, sure. Now, you may find some masculine societies in Eastern Europe or Southern Europe, say Albania and Slovakia, the more conservative European societies, have high scores in masculinity. On the other hand, the Northern European societies like Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and even Holland, well, they have much lower scores in masculinity, and they are very much for the welfare state. I find that Google is very much intent, social media giants are very much intent on feminizing the American society. That is the opposite. That is the opposite of what you need for your prophecy to come to pass, Todd. Now, Keith, I'm reading your comment that Japan has become Americanized, westernized. Sure, yes, you see more fat people in Japan. You see more lonely people, the hikikomori, who are nerds, essentially, who spend 2 years of their lives in their rooms, isolated, playing computer games, and only interacting with the world on social media. Sure, that's an example of this. Yeah, the Japanese culture, in its fundamental ways, is only becoming Americanized and westernized in superficial ways. I don't believe that the Japanese are going to tolerate slackers. I do doubt that you're going to see a woke revolution in Japan. There will be some people who do that, but they're always going to be treated with disdain. They're always going to be dishonored. And these people will be encouraged to commit suicide in extreme cases, as you suggest, Todd. But unfortunately, the United States, well, maybe even fortunately, either way, whether it's good or bad, I'm not going to comment on it. But the United States is moving away from the masculine cultural paradigm and toward the feminine cultural paradigm. The Americans who want a more masculine society, who admire Japan, well, typically they're conservative, of course, and they tend to have a more masculine cultural orientation. Yet they are on the losing end of the cultural war. The only way this can really change is if somehow the tech oligarchy is dismantled. And given the death grip that they have over the lobbying system and politicians in Washington, D.C., I just don't buy it. I do believe that the tech oligarchy have achieved regulatory capture, and whatever legislation comes out of D.C. on this matter will probably have been written by the tech, by the lobbyists and the lawyers to represent the tech oligarchy. So I do see, if anything, a very much a feminized version of American politics, vanilla. Now, if anything, this makes the probability of suicide camps and these ritual seppuku traditions of taking your own life to wash away your dishonor. This makes it virtually an impossible outcome. All right, so that's all I have for now.
Okay, Florian, final thoughts.
Final thoughts. I think twofold. So first of all, culture war and what Aleksey just said. Um, I don't think that right wingers or conservatives, more masculine minded people, are necessarily at the losing end of a cultural war. They just haven't learned to organize as well, right? For example, you have Jordan Peterson, right? So like people on the right in general like him, but what people like Peterson and others and Shapiro and so far doing, they're hawking their books, so they point people to buy their books, whereas Democrats and unions, they point their people towards signing up for the election, signing up to register as a Democrat. And if the right wing organizations would have the same zeal in selling in in making people register Republican, then the left wouldn't have as much power, because the last elections were just decided by, I don't know, 40, 50,000 votes out of like 30 million for one and 30 million for the other side, right? So it's to me, it seems to be less dire than it may look like. The effect of a losing election is always very, very binary, right? It's like a shit sandwich if you lost. But to get there, it's actually a very gradual, very, very, very subtle transition. And then otherwise, coming back to the collapse theme that we struck on at the beginning, um, I'm more of an optimist here, because I can imagine even in pre-modern civilizations, they had the energy problem as well, right? I imagine like all the cavemen sitting around a fire, and they contemplate, it's getting more and more expensive to hunt and gather firewood, all the wild animals out there, and they're just too many, and Gronk, like, unlike his grandfather, he cannot even bring people over the river there anymore. We completely lost it. And then Grushna comes and invents the bow and arrow, and all of a sudden the power differential changes, and that pre-modern civilization can prosper again. And they couldn't foresee something like bow and arrow until somebody invented it. And for that reason, I'm more optimistic. I think somebody will come along and invent something that will get us out of the current energy crisis, and then maybe we go to distant planets, as Elon Musk said, or we find something else. We find some other source to make really cheap energy, and then in 500 years we have the same problem again. But I always think humanity will find a way past a certain problem. If there's a bottleneck, people generally find a way to get through that bottleneck and thrive on the other side.
Okay, Keith, you get the last word of all.
Well, it's interesting how there's a number of different patterns of thought that somewhat converge with each other, that collectively predict that we're in a current crisis, and that some kind of collapse or something serious like that is about to happen. You have Peter Zion's analytical framework. You've got the old 1972 MIT study. You've got the analysis of Lind and Van Crevel that I was talking about earlier, that comes from the point of view of largely military history. You've got the fourth turning analytical framework. There's others as well, but the common theme in all of these is that a crisis is on the horizon, or we're in a crisis now. And I guess one of the big questions is, how big is it going to be? Is it going to be like the crisis of the late Middle Ages, or something less extreme or far-reaching? And what's interesting also is that within the ruling classes, particularly in the West, there's a division on how to respond to these crisis situations. Like a lot of the conflict that we see now is rooted in that, divisions within the ruling class. There's a number of commentators who've addressed this, like Michael Lind, Thomas Piketty is a French economist. I think Caleb Maupin, who's a Marxist, has some of the most interesting ideas on this. But there's this idea of how are we going to address, among elites, this is an issue of how are we going to address all of these different factors: economic, demographic, ecological, cultural, and so forth. And one faction in that are these neo-Malthusian types who basically say, well, we just need to have less consumption and smaller populations. And, these are the folks who'd probably be most enthusiastic about the suicide camps or whatever that Todd was talking about. And this strand of thought goes all the way back to at least Malthus, I have an article on the Attack the System website about it's a biographical article of William Godwin that talks about Godwin's debates with Malthus in the Enlightenment period. But there's this neo-Malthusian branch of the elite has always been there. A big thing with them has always been reducing population, reducing consumption, reducing the size of the lower orders demographically and stuff like that. And they're certainly out there. And then, of course, you have the tech bros and all of that kind of stuff as well. I do think that one issue is back to what I was saying earlier about the proliferation of failed states. I think that a key issue is going to be whether failed states continue to proliferate and become commonplace, and whether different societies to continue to fragment along socio-cultural lines. I think one thing that's a major contributor to the latter is the pervasive influence of American culture. A lot of critics of the United States talk about American military imperialism or economic imperialism, but I actually think cultural imperialism is even more pervasive for the simple reason that people everywhere around the world consume American media and entertainment and stuff like that. So, I've met plenty of people from other countries that know more about domestic American politics than many Americans do, because they just watch it on TV all over the world. And I think that America's culture war seems to be expanding to other countries as well, like all the debates about gender pronouns and all that kind of stuff. That kind of stuff is increasingly becoming commonplace in Latin America, in East Asia, in Africa, even in parts of the Middle East, and places you would never think it would be around. Eastern Europe. I mean, it's not as extreme as it is, say, in the United States or Western Europe, but it's moving in that direction. It's not going in the opposite direction. And I tend to wonder if that's going to be very similar to the sectarian religious conflicts that you had in the early modern period, the late Renaissance, early modern period, where you had the Protestant Reformation and all the wars of religion that came out of that, or like the Enlightenment, and then the anti-traditional revolutions that came out of the Enlightenment. I could see this, all of these cultural conflicts that had developed in the West and have been exported elsewhere. I could see that becoming a major source of social divisions in many, many other societies. And if you add to that mix wider, collapse scenario, and then a proliferation of failed states and things like that, that's something very similar to the late Middle Ages or the early modern period. So we'll see.
All right. Thank you, Keith and Florian and Aleksey. It's always a pleasure. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Flight podcast, signing off.